Welcome to Mystery Unlocked, where every story unlocks a new mystery waiting to be unraveled. Grab your favorite cup of coffee, settle in, and prepare to dive into a world full of twists, turns, and unexpected secrets. Stay curious and share the thrill with fellow mystery lovers. Let the adventure begin. Chapter 1: Death in the Study. "You'd think he'd have come down by now," muttered Beatrice Cavendish, wiping her hands on her apron as she peered toward the study door. It was nearly 6 in the evening, and Jonathan Henshaw had not emerged since his tea was brought up at 4. The housekeeper had worked in his household for years and knew his habits well. He disliked interruptions, but he was always punctual for supper. With a sigh, she knocked firmly on the door. "Mr. Your dinner is ready." No response. She hesitated, then turned the handle. The door was unlocked. Inside, the study smelled of ink, old paper, and the faint, lingering scent of cigar smoke. Jonathan Henshaw sat slumped at his desk, head tilted forward, spectacles askew. His hands rested limply on an open ledger. The inkpot beside him had tipped slightly, leaving a small blot on the paper. A chill ran through Beatrice as she stepped closer. "Sir," her voice wavered. She touched his shoulder. Cold. She drew back with a sharp intake of breath and backed toward the door. After a moment's hesitation, she steadied herself and hurried to the telephone. Inspector Lionel Merton stood with his arms folded, listening as Dr. Lawrence Quimby concluded his examination. The two men had worked together on enough cases to know when something was amiss. Yet tonight, the doctor's words were simple. Heart failure, most likely. No sign of foul play. Dr. Quimby straightened, rubbing his chin. "Given his age and history, I can't say I'm surprised." Miss Jane Marple, who had arrived moments earlier after hearing the news, watched the scene unfold with quiet attention. "Was there any sign of distress beforehand?" she inquired gently, addressing Beatrice. Beatrice, pale and visibly shaken, clutched the edges of her apron. "Not that I saw, Miss. He'd been his usual self this morning. Gave me a list of things to fetch from the grocer. And he asked me to send a letter." "A letter?" Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted. "Yes. I took it to the post myself, around noon." Dr. Quimby cleared his throat, bringing attention back to his report. "The death likely occurred sometime between 4 and 5. Rigor mortis hasn't fully set in. If he hadn't been found until morning, I'd have been more suspicious." Inspector Merton let out a short breath. "Well, if it's natural causes, there's nothing more to be done. A tragic end, but not an uncommon one." Miss Marple did not comment. Her keen eyes took in the details. The desk, the untouched supper tray, the small blot of ink on the paper. Something about it all felt unfinished. Jonathan Henshaw's funeral was a quiet affair. A solicitor by trade, he had few close acquaintances. His nearest relative, a nephew named Robbie Pritchard, arrived from London with a grim expression and a stiff manner. The village had heard little of Robbie in recent years, but murmurs spread quickly. Troubles with gambling, a falling out with his uncle over money. Robbie did not weep at the service. Miss Marple watched him with interest. People grieve in different ways, of course, but there was something peculiarly tense about the young man's posture. After the funeral, Henshaw's affairs were settled swiftly. He had left his estate largely intact, though rumors suggested changes had been made to his will shortly before his death. If Robbie was disappointed, he gave no sign. The village settled back into its routine. Then the letters arrived. Beatrice was the first to receive one. She found it in her morning post, addressed in Jonathan Henshaw's precise, old-fashioned handwriting. She stared at it for a long moment before breaking the seal. Her breath caught. "You thought I didn't know, didn't you? But secrets don't stay buried, Beatrice. You'll pay for what you've done." Her hands trembled. This had to be some cruel joke. Mr. Henshaw was dead. Across the village, Dr. Quimby opened his own letter, only to find a similar chilling message inside. "A doctor should do no harm. But you did, didn't you? You thought it was forgotten. You were wrong." Robbie Pritchard's letter was shorter, but no less ominous. "Sins are not so easily forgiven, my boy." By the time Miss Marple heard of the letters, 3 households in the village had been thrown into quiet disarray. She sat with Beatrice in the small kitchen of Henshaw's house, listening as the woman relayed the story. "It can't be real," Beatrice whispered, gripping her teacup as though it might anchor her. "He's dead. He can't have written it." "No," Miss Marple agreed mildly, "but someone else could have." Beatrice's gaze lifted sharply. "You don't think?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. Ghosts don't write letters, my dear, but people do. By midday, she had learned of Dr. Quimby's and Robbie's letters as well. Inspector Merton dismissed them outright. A prank, he said with certainty. Someone with access to his handwriting and a nasty sense of humor. Miss Marple did not argue. Instead, she sat quietly, considering. If this were a prank, why send letters to these three, and only these three? If someone wanted to frighten them, what was the purpose? And why now? More importantly, how had the letters been posted after Jonathan Henshaw's death? She sipped her tea, thoughtful. There was a mystery here. And, as she well knew, the dead never spoke, unless someone made sure they did. Chapter 2. Letters from Beyond the village postman, Harold Finch, was a man of routine. Every morning at precisely 8, he made his rounds, delivering letters with the efficiency of a man who had spent 30 years in the same job. But today, as he placed a thick envelope into Beatrice Cavendish's hands, he noticed her face turn white. "You all right, Miss Cavendish?" he asked, peering over his spectacles. Beatrice barely heard him. She gripped the envelope, her fingers pressing into the familiar scrawl of Jonathan Henshaw's handwriting. It was unmistakable, his precise, old-fashioned penmanship. The way he wrote her full name in a manner few did. "Impossible," I asked. "I'm fine," she murmured and quickly shut the door. Her hand shook as she broke the seal. "You thought I didn't know, didn't you? But secrets don't stay buried, Beatrice. You'll pay for what you've done." The words blurred before her eyes. It wasn't possible. Mr. Henshaw had been dead for a week. Dr. Lawrence Quimby frowned as he slit open his Morning Post, reaching for his tea absent-mindedly. He had been uneasy since Jonathan Henshaw's death, because Miss Marple's quiet, watchful presence at the scene had unsettled him. He had declared the cause of death with confidence, yet something about the matter continued to gnaw at him. He unfolded the letter and scanned the words. "A doctor should do no harm, but you did, didn't you? You thought it was forgotten. You were wrong." The cup slipped from his grasp, clattering against the saucer. He read it again, and again. His fingers traced the ink, the shape of the letters. It was Henshaw's handwriting. Every stroke of the pen was identical. And yet, he swallowed hard and sat back. This had to be a cruel joke, or something worse. Robbie Pritchard opened his letter last. He was staying at the Red Lion, the village's modest inn, having made no effort to return to London since his uncle's funeral. Not that anyone was particularly surprised. His history with gambling and debts meant he was likely waiting for some financial windfall before making a move. He read the letter in silence. "Sins are not so easily forgiven, my boy." A cold sensation prickled at the back of his neck. This wasn't possible. His uncle had been dead for days. His first instinct was anger. Someone was playing a trick on him. Someone who wanted him to squirm. But who? And why? He sat back in his chair, staring at the paper as if it might vanish. It didn't. Word of the letters spread quickly through the village, as things always did in St. Mary Mead. By midday, Miss Marple was already seated in Beatrice Cavendish's small kitchen, listening attentively as the housekeeper relayed her fears. Beatrice's voice trembled. It has to be some kind of forgery, a nasty joke." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Perhaps, but the handwriting was identical." "You say?" Beatrice nodded fervently. "Exactly the same, as if he'd written it himself." Miss Marple took a sip of tea, her gaze distant. "And the letter, was it typed or handwritten?" Beatrice hesitated. "Typed." A small smile touched Miss Marple's lips. "Now, that is interesting." Beatrice's brow furrowed. "Interesting." Miss Marple nodded. "It means the letters could have been prepared at any time, long before his death." Beatrice paled. "You think he knew he was going to die?" "I think," Miss Marple said softly, "that someone wanted it to appear that way." Beatrice shivered. You don't think he's haunting us, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple chuckled lightly. "No, my dear. Ghosts don't write letters. But people do." Dr. Quimby was not a man easily rattled, but when Miss Marple arrived at his surgery that afternoon, she found him uncharacteristically tense. Miss Marple greeted stiffly, gesturing for her to sit. "I assume you've heard." She folded her hands in her lap. "Yes. It's rather peculiar, isn't it?" Dr. Quimby gave a forced laugh. "Some local mischief, no doubt. There's always someone willing to play a nasty trick." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "But this is rather a specific trick, wouldn't you say?" Dr. Quimby's smile faltered. Miss Marple watched him carefully. "If I may ask, What exactly did Mr. Henshaw's letter say to you? Dr. Quimby's fingers tightened around his pen. It made some wild accusation, that's all, utter nonsense, about the past. His head snapped up. I beg your pardon. Miss Marple's smile was serene. You see, the letters seemed to be addressed only to those who had some connection to Mr. Henshaw, and they appear to accuse the recipient of something. Now, if we were to assume that the real author of these letters is not Mr. Henshaw himself, but someone else, then that person must know something about each of you, something personal. Dr. Quimby's face was unreadable. A dangerous assumption. Miss Marple, she simply smiled. Only if one has something to hide. Robbie Pritchard had no patience for subtlety. He stormed into the local pub, the Red Lion, slamming his letter onto the counter. All right, which one of you is responsible for this? He demanded. The pub fell silent. The barkeep, George Whitaker, raised an eyebrow. Responsible for what, lad? This, Robbie snapped, shoving the letter toward him. My uncle's been dead a week, and somehow I'm getting letters from him. Someone's having a laugh at my expense. Agnes Pennington, seated at a corner table, leaned forward with interest. The well-known crime writer, always eager for a mystery, tapped her chin. How fascinating, she murmured. A message from beyond the grave. Robbie scowled. Oh, don't start, Agnes. It's a forgery, obviously. But who's behind it? Agnes sipped her sherry. Well, that depends on what it says, doesn't it? Robbie hesitated, then muttered. It just says, sins are not so easily forgiven. The silence deepened. Well, Agnes said cheerfully, that certainly has a dramatic flair. Almost poetic, wouldn't you say? Robbie's jaw tightened. It's not poetic, it's a threat. Agnes studied him. Then perhaps the real question is, what exactly have you done to warrant such a message? Miss Marple arrived at the pub just as the conversation was turning heated. She took a quiet seat, listening. Inspector Merton entered moments later, looking irritated. I've heard enough about these ridiculous letters. Robbie turned on him. Ridiculous? You think this is funny? Merton exhaled sharply. I think someone is trying to stir up trouble. Letters don't arrive from dead men. Miss Marple gave a gentle smile. No, indeed. But they do arrive from very alive ones. Merton glanced at her. You have a theory, do you? She took a sip of tea. I merely find it fascinating that whoever sent these letters knew precisely who to send them to. Merton frowned. Meaning? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Meaning, Inspector, that the person behind this is not playing a prank. They are accusing. She set down her cup. And I do believe that means they want something to come to light. Soft cliffhanger. Beatrice, Dr. Quimby, and Robbie exchanged uneasy glances. The dead did not write letters, but someone wanted them to believe they did. Before we continue, we'd love to know where you're watching us from. Drop your city and country in the comments. Bella Chapter 3. Secrets in inked air in St. Mary Mead had grown thick with unease. In a village where gossip spread faster than the Morning Post, the mystery of the letters had ignited a quiet but insistent panic. Who had sent them, and why had they been addressed only to Beatrice, Dr. Quimby, and Robbie Pritchard? Miss Marple, ever observant, knew that secrets had a way of surfacing when prodded, and this mystery was already beginning to unravel in the most interesting way. It was late morning when Miss Marple arrived at Jonathan Henshaw's house. Beatrice Cavendish, looking pale and weary, answered the door. Oh, Miss Marple, I don't know what to think anymore. She stepped aside, allowing the elderly sleuth to enter. I barely slept last night. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing that blasted letter. Miss Marple patted her arm reassuringly. Fear is often the companion of guilt, my dear. But the question is, are you guilty of something? Beatrice gasped. Miss Marple, I would never. She stopped short, looking flustered. That is to say, I've done nothing wrong. Miss Marple nodded gently. Of course, but someone believes you have. And whoever sent those letters has gone to great lengths to make sure you feel the weight of it. Beatrice's hands twisted in her apron. It's wicked, that's what it is. Miss Marple glanced around the house, her sharp eyes taking in the subtle changes since Jonathan Henshaw's death. The house had a strange emptiness now, as though it knew its master would never return. Papers still sat in neat stacks on the desk in the study, but something was missing, something important. Tell me, Beatrice, Miss Marple said as she stepped toward the study door. Did Mr. Henshaw keep a typewriter? Beatrice blinked. Why, yes. He always typed his legal documents himself before sending them to be properly written up. And where is it now? Beatrice hesitated. I don't know. It was always on his desk. But when the police came that night, they must have moved it. Miss Marple hummed softly to herself. Interesting. Meanwhile, at the village surgery, Dr. Quimby was having a restless morning. Patients came and went, but his thoughts were on the letter that had landed on his doorstep the previous day. A doctor should do no harm, but you did, didn't you? You thought it was forgotten. You were wrong. The words haunted him. He was staring blankly at his desk when a sharp knock made him sit up. "Come in," he called, forcing his voice to sound normal. The door opened to reveal Miss Marple. She stepped inside with a kind smile. "Dr. Quimby, I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, Miss Marple." He gestured for her to sit, though his hands fidgeted on the desk. "I assume you're here about the letters." She tilted her head. "Yes, they are rather troubling, aren't they?" Dr. Quimby forced a chuckle. "A silly prank, that's all." Miss Marple gave him a knowing look. "Do you really believe that, doctor?" He hesitated. Then, lowering his voice, he muttered, "If I did, I wouldn't be feeling like this." She watched him carefully. "Then tell me, Dr. Quimby, what is it that you're afraid of?" His jaw tightened. "I have nothing to hide." Miss Marple smiled slightly. "No, of course not, but the letter you received suggests that someone believes you do. The question is, what incident in your past could possibly make you a target?" Dr. Quimby stiffened. "I don't know what you mean." Miss Marple did not press further. Instead, she merely folded her hands and said, "It's curious, isn't it, that these letters seem so personal? Someone had to know just the right words to make you uneasy." He said nothing. Miss Marple stood. "I won't trouble you any longer, Dr. Bob, to consider if this is no prank. Then the person behind it may know far more than they ought to." Dr. Quimby swallowed hard. "Are you suggesting I'm in danger?" She smiled. "Not necessarily, but I do believe that whoever sent these letters is far from finished." She left him sitting in silence, staring at his desk. Across the village, Robbie Pritchard had spent most of the morning nursing a drink at the Red Lion. He had not told anyone, but the letter had rattled him more than he cared to admit. "Sins are not so easily forgiven, my boy." His uncle had always been a strict, unyielding man. He had made it clear that he disapproved of Robbie's choices, his gambling, his debts, his inability to hold a steady job. But surely even Jonathan Henshaw wouldn't go so far as to haunt him from the grave. Yet, the handwriting was undeniably his. Robbie took a long sip of his whiskey. He had half a mind to tear the letter up and be done with it, but something held him back. What if the letter was a warning? What if someone was trying to tell him something? Or worse, what if someone was trying to frame him? He had barely finished that thought when the door of the pub swung open. He looked up, expecting to see the barkeep, but instead, he found himself face to face with Miss Marple. "Good afternoon, Mr. Pritchard," she greeted pleasantly, taking a seat opposite him. Robbie grunted. "If you're here about the letter, I don't want to talk about it." Miss Marple folded her hands. "I understand, but humor an old woman, will you? Have you considered what your uncle might have meant?" Robbie scowled. "If he meant anything at all, it was just another way of telling me I was a disappointment." Miss Marple's expression softened. "Perhaps, but why send it after his death? If we assume that someone else sent it, then that person must have had a very particular reason." Robbie shifted uncomfortably. "You're saying someone wants me to believe my uncle left me a message?" She nodded. "And the same goes for Beatrice and Dr. Quimby. 3 different people, 3 different letters. But what do you all have in common?" Robbie hesitated. "We all knew my uncle, obviously." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "But did you all share a secret with him?" Robbie tensed. Miss Marple watched him closely. "Secrets have a way of surfacing at the most inconvenient times, don't they?" He said nothing. Miss Marple stood. "Think on it, Mr. Pritchard. The dead do not send letters, but the living, oh, they can be far more dangerous." Soft cliffhanger. That evening Miss Marple returned home deep in thought. She had spoken to each recipient of the letters, and in each case, she had seen something: guilt, fear, hesitation. Each of them was hiding something, and whoever had sent those letters knew it. Chapter 4. The Typewriters. Miss Marple sat by the window of her small cottage, knitting in hand, but her mind far from the pattern she was following. The mystery had begun to take shape, and the more she considered it, the more certain she became whoever had sent the letters had known precisely what they were doing. She had spoken to Beatrice, to Dr. Quimby, and to Robbie Pritchard. Each of them had received a letter. Each of them had reacted in a way that suggested guilt of what, she was not yet sure. But the letters had been carefully crafted, not just in words, but in their impact. And that meant something very important. The sender knew them, the sender understood their pasts, and most crucially, the sender had access to Jonathan Henshaw's typewriter. Miss Marple set down her knitting and rang for her housekeeper, Dorothy. "My dear, would you mind fetching me my hat? I believe I shall pay a visit to Inspector Merton." Inspector Merton was in no mood for village gossip when Miss Marple arrived at the station. "I suppose you've come about those wretched letters," he grumbled as he waved her into his office. "Half the village is in a panic over them. I've had Mrs. Parker in here twice already, convinced she's next." Miss Marple smiled mildly. "Well, I can't say I blame her, Inspector. The idea of a man sending messages from beyond the grave is quite unsettling." Merton sighed. "There's a logical explanation. Of course, someone typed them out, posted them, and is having a good laugh at everyone else's expense." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "And that's precisely why I came." "The typewriter, Inspector Jonathan Henshaw's typewriter. What became of it after his death?" Merton blinked. "His typewriter? Yes. Beatrice Cavendish tells me he used it often. Yet, when I visited his house yesterday, it was nowhere to be seen." Merton frowned. "That's odd. If it wasn't there, it should have been listed with his belongings." He reached for a folder and began flipping through notes. "We made an inventory of everything in the house when we ruled the death as natural." Miss Marple waited patiently as he scanned the document. After a long pause, Merton exhaled sharply. "That's peculiar. It's not listed." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Which means, Inspector, that someone removed it before an official record could be made." Merton rubbed his temple. "So, you're saying, whoever sent the letters took the typewriter?" Miss Marple gave a gentle nod. "It would make sense, wouldn't it? A typewritten letter is far more difficult to trace than a handwritten one, and if one wanted to make it seem as though Jonathan Henshaw had written them himself, what better way than to use his very own typewriter?" Merton sighed. "That means we've got a thief on our hands, as well as a troublemaker." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "Oh, I do think it's more than just mischief, Inspector. Whoever sent those letters wanted to stir something up. The question is, why?" Merton shut the folder with a sigh. "I suppose you have a theory." Miss Marple smiled. "Only that the answer lies in the past. I have a feeling that Jonathan Henshaw knew something dangerous." Merton leaned forward. "You think he was murdered?" Miss Marple's expression was serene. "I think it would be unwise to dismiss the possibility." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made her way back to Jonathan Henshaw's house. Beatrice Cavendish let her in, though she still looked uneasy. "Miss Marple, I can't get that letter out of my head," she confessed. "Why would someone want to frighten me?" Miss Marple patted her arm. "Perhaps because you know something, even if you don't realize it yet." Beatrice frowned. "What could I possibly know?" Miss Marple glanced around the house. "Tell me, Beatrice, in the days before his death, did Mr. Henshaw seem troubled?" Beatrice hesitated. "Well, he did seem a bit distracted. He spent a lot of time in his study, going through old papers." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Old papers, you say?" Beatrice nodded. "He said something about making sure things were in order. I thought he just meant his will." Miss Marple pursed her lips. "And did anyone visit him?" Beatrice hesitated. "Dr. Quimby came by the day before he died. They spoke for a while, but I didn't hear what about." Miss Marple nodded. "And what of Robbie Pritchard?" Beatrice looked surprised. "Well, yes, he came as well, but only briefly. I think they argued." Miss Marple's mind whirred. 2 of the letter recipients had been with Jonathan just before his death, and now someone wanted them frightened. Coincidence? Hardly. She turned to Beatrice. "My dear, do you know if Mr. Henshaw kept any old correspondence? Letters, documents, anything he might have been reviewing?" Beatrice frowned. "There was a box of papers he took from his study to his bedroom a few days before he died. But after the police came, I never saw it again." Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line. "How very interesting." That evening, Miss Marple paid a visit to Agnes Pennington, the crime novelist who lived just beyond the village green. Agnes had a sharp mind, and though she often exaggerated for the sake of storytelling, she understood how mysteries unfolded. Agnes greeted cheerfully. "I was wondering when you'd come knocking." Miss Marple took a seat, accepting a cup of tea. "You've heard about the letters, I assume?" "Oh, my dear, of course. It's the most thrilling thing to happen here in ages. Miss Marple smiled. And what do you make of it? Agnes sipped her tea. Well, the way I see it, the letters are either a warning or a test. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. A test. Agnes leaned forward. Think about it. Whoever sent them wanted to see how the recipients would react. And from what I hear, all three of them have been rather shaken. Miss Marple nodded, which suggests the sender knows them well. Or, Agnes added, knows about them. Miss Marple's mind clicked into place. The missing typewriter, the missing papers, the recipients of the letters. Someone was digging into Jonathan Henshaw's past, and Jonathan Henshaw had known something that had gotten him killed. As Miss Marple left Agnes's house, she was certain of one thing. This was no prank. Someone was orchestrating a game of fear, and the only way to stop it was to uncover what Jonathan Henshaw had taken to his grave. Chapter 5. A whisper from the Gravetti morning air in St. Mary Mead carried a chill, though it was not the weather that made the village uneasy. Whispers of the letters had spread, and despite Inspector Merton's attempts to dismiss them as a prank, there was a lingering sense that something far more sinister was at play. Miss Marple, ever watchful, had spent the early hours of the day piecing together what she knew: the missing typewriter, the missing papers, the carefully chosen letter recipients. Each thread led back to Jonathan Henshaw's past, and it was becoming clear that his death, though ruled natural, was anything but. She decided it was time for another conversation with someone who might have noticed something crucial without realizing it. The vicarage was a place of quiet reflection, but when Miss Marple arrived, she found the vicar's wife, Mrs. Helen Pritchard, in a fluster. She was setting a tray of tea when she noticed Miss Marple at the door, and quickly composed herself. Miss Marple, what a pleasant surprise, she said, though her voice held tension. I imagine you're here about the letters. Miss Marple nodded, stepping inside. Yes, my dear, and about your nephew Ruby. Helen's hands tightened around the tray. He's been behaving dreadfully since receiving his letter, drinking at the Red Lion and refusing to speak of it. Miss Marple observed her carefully. And what do you make of it, Helen? You've known Robbie all his life. Helen sighed. Oh, I don't know what to think. He's always been reckless, but this has truly frightened him. She hesitated before adding, I know he argued with Jonathan before his death, and now, to receive a letter that seems to come from beyond the grave, it's as if Jonathan wants him to remember something he'd rather forget. Miss Marple leaned forward. Helen, did Jonathan ever mention being worried about something before he passed? Helen frowned, thinking, now that you mention it, a few days before his death, he came to see my husband. He was troubled about something but wouldn't say what. My husband assured him that whatever weighed on his conscience, it could be put right. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Did he say it must be put right? Helen hesitated. Yes, actually, he said, if I don't make amends now, it'll be too late. Miss Marple sat back, thoughtful. Jonathan Henshaw had been planning to put something in order, but what? And had he died before he could do it, or because he tried? Miss Marple's next stop was the Red Lion. It was early enough in the day that the pub was mostly empty, save for a few regulars and Robbie Pritchard, who sat nursing a drink at the corner table. She approached without hesitation. Good morning, Mr. Pritchard. Robbie barely looked up. If you're here to talk about the letter, I've nothing to say. Miss Marple took a seat opposite him. Oh, I rather think you do. And I think Jonathan Henshaw knew it too. Robbie stiffened, his fingers tightening around his glass. What's that supposed to mean? Miss Marple folded her hands. I spoke to your Aunt Helen. She tells me you and Jonathan argued before his death. Robbie scoffed. We argued all the time. He never approved of me. Miss Marple tilted her head. But this time, it was different, wasn't it? Robbie's jaw clenched. He called me a coward. Said I had a debt to pay, but I'd been running from it. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. A debt, Robbie, not just money, I imagine. He exhaled sharply. No, it was about something that happened years ago, something I thought was buried. He hesitated, then muttered, but it seems the past doesn't stay buried, does it? Miss Marple did not press further. She merely observed, allowing the weight of silence to settle. Finally, Robbie exhaled. It was about a woman, Margaret. She was engaged to my uncle once, long before I was born, but she disappeared. No one ever spoke of her again. I asked him about it once when I was younger, but he warned me never to bring her up. Miss Marple's expression remained calm, but inside, her mind raced. A woman who vanished. A man who spent his final days trying to set something right. And now letters designed to bring guilt to the surface. Miss Marple left the pub deep in thought. She had no doubt now whoever sent the letters was forcing old sins into the light. She needed to see the one place where secrets often remained, even when everyone else had forgotten. The village records office. She arrived at the small building, where Mr. Gordon Trent, the village clerk, greeted her with mild surprise. "Miss Marple, what brings you here?" She smiled kindly. "I was hoping to look at some old records, if you don't mind. Specifically, anything regarding a woman named Margaret, who was once engaged to Jonathan Henshaw." Trent's eyebrows rose. "Goodness, that's a name I haven't heard in years." He shuffled over to a set of old books. "Margaret Elmsley. If I recall correctly, she lived here in the village when she was young." But one day he stopped, looking suddenly uncomfortable. Miss Marple finished for him. "One day, she disappeared." Trent hesitated before nodding. It was all rather hushed up. "Officially, she left for London. But there were rumors." Miss Marple's voice was soft. "What kind of rumors?" Trent glanced around before lowering his voice. "That she never left at all." A chill ran through Miss Marple. "If she never left, Mr. Trent," she said carefully, "then where did she go?" That night, Miss Marple sat in her cottage, turning over the day's discoveries. A woman who had vanished, a man who had spent his final days in guilt, and letters designed to unearth secrets long buried. She had a dreadful suspicion now, one that made her fingers tighten on her knitting. If Margaret Elmsley had never left the village, then where had she been all these years? And was it possible that she had never left at all, because she had never been able to? Chapter 6. The House That Kept Secrets. Miss Marple sat in her parlor, knitting, resting idly on her lap. The weight of her discovery lingered. Margaret Elmsley had vanished decades ago, and yet whispers suggested she had never truly left. It was a most troubling notion, one that led to an even more sinister question. Had she disappeared, or had she been made to disappear? If Jonathan Henshaw had been trying to unearth the truth before his death, then someone, perhaps the same person who had sent the letters, had every reason to stop him. The answers lay in the past, and there was one place where the past had remained untouched for years: Jonathan Henshaw's house. Beatrice Cavendish hesitated when Miss Marple arrived. "You wish to look through the study again?" she asked, clearly uneasy. Miss Marple nodded. "I believe Jonathan left something behind, something important. I wouldn't ask if it weren't necessary, my dear." Beatrice hesitated a moment longer before stepping aside. "Very well, Miss Marple, but I do wish this business would be over soon." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "So do I, Beatrice, so do I." She stepped inside and made her way directly to the study. The room was just as she had left it: neat, orderly, with no sign of the missing typewriter or the box of papers Beatrice had mentioned. But something felt off. Miss Marple had spent a lifetime observing people, but she had also developed a keen awareness of spaces. And this space, she realized now, had been altered. She moved toward the bookshelf. It was filled with leather-bound books, all arranged with meticulous care. But when she reached out and pressed against one, she noticed a small shift. The shelf wobbled slightly. She tilted her head. A poorly secured shelf in Jonathan Henshaw's carefully ordered home. Unlikely. She pressed again, this time with more force. A soft click sounded, and to her astonishment, the entire section of the bookshelf moved inward, revealing a small, concealed compartment. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Inside, stacked neatly, were a handful of papers. She reached in carefully, extracting them. The first few were old letters, yellowed with time. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the name at the bottom of several pages made her breath catch. Margaret Elmsley. She quickly scanned the letters. They were filled with affectionate words, yet there was an underlying tone of unease. "Jonathan, I cannot do this any longer. I must leave before it is too late. If they find out what I know..." The sentence was never finished. The ink trailed off, as though the writer had been interrupted. Miss Marple's fingers trembled slightly. What had Margaret known? And had it been the reason she disappeared? The last letter was different. The handwriting was Jonathan's. "I know what happened to Margaret. I should have spoken up long ago, but I was afraid. I cannot be silent any longer. If anything happens to me, the truth must come out." A sudden noise made Miss Marple spin around. Beatrice stood in the doorway, her face pale. "Miss Marple," she whispered, eyes fixed on the papers in her hand. "What have you found?" Beatrice sat in the parlor, hands gripping the arms of her chair. "She wrote to him," she murmured, disbelief in her voice. All these years, I thought she had left willingly. Miss Marple regarded her carefully. What do you remember about Margaret Beatrice? Beatrice hesitated. I was very young when she disappeared, but I remember my parents speaking, in hushed tones, about her. There was talk that she had been involved in something scandalous. Miss Marple leaned forward. Scandalous in what way? Beatrice swallowed. Something to do with the family estate. There were rumors that she knew something about the land, something that could have ruined someone's claim to it. Miss Marple's mind whirred. If Margaret had uncovered something about the Henshaw estate, and if Jonathan had been trying to bring that truth to light, then it was possible and likely that both of them had been silenced. Jonathan's death had seemed natural. But what if it wasn't? And now, someone was sending letters, stirring the past to the surface once more. Miss Marple left the house with a new sense of urgency. She made her way directly to Inspector Merton's office, where she found the inspector looking over a report. I do hope I'm not disturbing. Inspector, she said lightly. Merton sighed. Miss Marple, if you're here about those blasted letters again, I've found something, she interrupted, that got his attention. He sat up straighter. Go on. Miss Marple placed the letters on his desk. These were hidden in Jonathan Henshaw's home. Letters from a woman named Margaret Elmsley. She disappeared years ago, and Jonathan seemed to believe her disappearance was not voluntary. Merton frowned, flipping through the pages. And you think this has something to do with his death? Miss Marple folded her hands. Inspector, do you believe in coincidences? Merton grumbled. Not particularly, neither do I. Miss Marple's voice was firm. Jonathan Henshaw planned to reveal a secret about Margaret Elmsley's disappearance before Chapter 7. The truth beneath our fit. Inspector Merton leaned back in his chair, frowning at the old letters Miss Marple had placed before him. Outside, the afternoon light slanted through the office window, casting long shadows. You're suggesting, Merton said slowly, tapping his fingers against the desk, that Jonathan Henshaw was killed because of something that happened decades ago. Miss Marple, seated primly across from him, gave a small, knowing smile. Murderers rarely act without cause, Inspector. If Jonathan had stumbled upon something dangerous, something long buried, it stands to reason that someone would want to silence him before he could reveal it. Merton sighed, rubbing his temples. You think this Margaret Elmsley never left the village? Miss Marple's voice was quiet but firm. No, Inspector. I believe Margaret Elmsley was never able to leave the village. Merton's eyes darkened. You're saying she was murdered? Miss Marple nodded. And I fear she is still here, somewhere. The room fell into a weighted silence. Merton exhaled sharply. You do realize how serious an accusation that is, Miss Marple? Quite, she said mildly. But consider this, someone has gone to great lengths to ensure that Margaret Elmsley's name was erased from village memory. And now, Jonathan Henshaw's attempt to unearth her story has led to his own untimely end. The letters being sent are not the work of a ghost, Inspector. They are the work of a mind determined to remind us all of something we were meant to forget. Merton drummed his fingers against the desk, thinking. So, where do we start? Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Where all buried secrets begin, Inspector. The ground beneath our feet. They started with the Henshaw estate, an old property that had remained in the family for generations. Though the house itself had been modernized over time, the land surrounding it was old-unchanged. Beatrice Cavendish, hesitant but willing, granted them permission to search the grounds. I can't say I approve of all this, she murmured, wringing her hands. But if there's any truth to it, I'd rather know than live in ignorance. It was a gray afternoon as Inspector Merton, along with a small team, began combing through the land behind the house. Miss Marple stood at the edges, watching the process with quiet intensity. The key, she knew, was finding where Margaret had been hidden. If Margaret was indeed silenced, she murmured to Merton, whoever did it would have needed a place no one would question, a site that would not be disturbed. Merton scanned the land. A well, a collapsed structure. Miss Marple's fingers tightened around the handle of her bag. A garden, Inspector. A beautiful, untouchable garden. Beatrice, overhearing, stiffened. The old rose garden, she whispered. My grandfather planted it years ago, just before Margaret disappeared. Miss Marple's expression did not change. It did not take long. The soil beneath the rose bushes had always been strangely compacted, as if something had been flattened beneath the roots. But as the digging began, unease settled over the group. Then, a sharp intake of breath, Inspector. One of the men called out. Merton strode forward. There, half buried among tangled roots, was what remained of a woman's bones. Silence spread like a fog dot. Miss Marple closed her eyes. Margaret Elmsley had not left the village. She had been here all along. That evening, the village of St. Mary Mead buzzed with hushed speculation. Word had spread quickly after all. One did not simply find a body in the garden of a respected family without consequence. Miss Marple, however, was not one to be caught up in gossip. She sat in her cottage, fingers working steadily at her knitting, as she considered the next step. A body had been found. Yes, but that was only one part of the mystery. The real question remained. Who had buried Margaret Elmsley? And who was now sending the letters, ensuring her name was spoken once more? The past had returned, but the past did not return on its own. Chapter 8. The Shadow of the Past. Morning after the discovery in the Henshaw Estates rose garden. St. Mary Mead was humming with speculation. The villagers, usually content with their quiet routines, had become restless. A decades-old body, unearthed in a respected family's garden, was enough to shake even the most hardened gossips. Miss Marple, however, was not one to dwell on preferred facts, and the facts were clear. Margaret Elmsley had not vanished willingly. She had been silenced, but by whom? And why now, after all these years, had someone chosen to dredge up the past by sending those letters? She suspected that Jonathan Henshaw's death and the sudden emergence of these messages were no coincidence. Someone wanted to remind the village of what had happened to Margaret, but why? And more importantly, who? Miss Marple arrived at the Red Lion just as the pub was opening. Inside, the air was thick with pipe smoke and murmured conversations. Robbie Pritchard sat at the far end of the room, his fingers drumming against a half-empty glass of whiskey. Miss Marple approached him without hesitation. "Good morning, Mr. Pritchard." Robbie scowled. "If you've come to pry Miss Marple, you're wasting your time." She sat across from him, her face as composed as ever. "On the contrary, I believe you have quite a bit to say." Robbie exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "Everyone in this village has been whispering about the body in the garden, as if we weren't already cursed with those damn letters." Miss Marple's voice was soft but insistent. "Jonathan Henshaw tried to tell you something before he died, about Margaret Elmsley." Robbie hesitated, his fingers tightening around his glass. "He said I needed to own up, to pay my debt." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And did you?" Robbie let out a bitter laugh. "How could I? I didn't even know what he meant at first." He glanced at her, his eyes dark. "But now I think I do." Miss Marple waited, knowing that silence often encouraged the truth more than questions ever could. Robbie exhaled. "I think Jonathan knew who killed Margaret. I think he was trying to tell me before he stopped," shaking his head. "I should have listened." Miss Marple studied him carefully. "If Jonathan knew, then so does someone else. Someone who didn't want him speaking." Robbie nodded grimly. "And that someone might still be here." Miss Marple left the Red Lion with a new sense of urgency. Robbie Pritchard might not have known the whole truth, but he had confirmed something important. Jonathan Henshaw had been on the verge of revealing Margaret's murderer before he died. She needed to re-examine the suspects. She considered Beatrice Cavendish first. She had been the one to find Jonathan dead. Had she known what he was planning to say? Could she have acted to stop him? Then there was Helen Pritchard, the vicar's wife, who had spoken of her nephew's distress, but had offered little in the way of her own opinions. Was she hiding something? And finally, there was Inspector Merton himself. Though she trusted his instincts, there was always the possibility that someone within the investigation had a reason to keep the past buried. Miss Marple decided to visit Beatrice first. The Cavendish home was quiet when Miss Marple arrived. Beatrice greeted her with a tense expression. "Miss Marple, I assume you have more questions." "I do, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "But I only ask them to find the truth." Beatrice hesitated before stepping aside. "Then ask what you must." Miss Marple entered the sitting room, her eyes scanning the space with quiet curiosity. There were no signs of distress, no frantic movements, no disarray. If Beatrice was hiding something, she was doing so with remarkable control. Miss Marple settled into a chair. "Tell me, Beatrice, when Jonathan died, did he say anything? Any last words?" Beatrice stiffened. "No. He was already gone when I found him." Miss Marple watched her closely. "And yet, you never questioned his death." Beatrice's hands tightened into fists. "I did question it, but what was I to do? The doctor said it was his heart. And now her voice wavered. And now you suggest that someone killed him. Miss Marple nodded gently. I do. Beatrice swallowed hard. Then who? Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she leaned forward. Beatrice, my dear, I believe you knew Margaret Elmsley better than you let on. Beatrice paled. What? No, Miss Marple's voice remained calm. You said you were young when she disappeared, but young or not, you remember her, don't you? Beatrice's hands trembled slightly. Then, after a long pause, she whispered, she was kind to me. Miss Marple's gaze softened. And yet, she vanished without a trace. Didn't that trouble you? Beatrice's eyes filled with something unreadable, pain perhaps. Or guilt. Of course it did, but no one spoke of her. It was as if she had never existed. Miss Marple sighed. Because someone made it so. As Miss Marple left the Cavendish home, she knew she was getting closer. Beatrice had not killed Margaret. Of that she was certain. But she knew something, and it was only a matter of time before the truth surfaced. That evening, as Miss Marple sat in her parlor knitting, a thought struck her. The letters, whoever had sent them, was not just stirring up trouble. They were trying to force the murderer's hand. Someone wanted justice. But would justice come before another life was taken? Chapter 9. The letter that changed everything. It was a crisp morning in St. Mary Mead. The kind that carried the scent of damp earth and wood. The village, usually drowsy in the early hours, was abuzz with speculation over the body found in the Henshaw estate's rose garden. But while others gossiped, Miss Marple sat in her parlor, deep in thought. The pieces of the mystery were beginning to form a picture, but there were still gaps, important ones. She knew that Margaret Elmsley had not simply disappeared. She had been murdered and buried beneath the very garden meant to bring beauty to the estate. She knew Jonathan Henshaw had been close to revealing something before his untimely death, and she knew that the letters, those eerie, anonymous messages, were meant to provoke, to stir up memories long buried. But who was behind them? And, more importantly, why now? As Miss Marple pondered, a sharp knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She rose, adjusting her shawl, and opened it to find young Tommy Fletcher standing there, his cheeks flushed from the cold. Message for you, Miss Marple, he said, thrusting an envelope into her hands. Why, thank you, Tommy, she smiled, but her eyes narrowed slightly as she examined the envelope. It was the same aged paper, the same careful handwriting. Another letter. Miss Marple wasted no time. She settled into her armchair and carefully unfolded the note. The past is rising, Miss Marple. The truth will not stay hidden much longer. But beware, the closer you get, the more dangerous it becomes. Justice is long overdue. Follow the place where love turned to death. Her fingers tightened around the paper. This was no ordinary cryptic message. This was a warning. The place where love turned to death, she murmured. What could it mean? Margaret Elmsley had been buried in the rose garden, but that was not where she had died. If she had been murdered elsewhere and moved later, that would explain why no one had discovered the truth sooner. Miss Marple set the letter aside. She needed to act quickly. Her first stop would be Robbie Pritchard. At the Red Lion. She found Robbie nursing a pint, deep in thought. At the sight of her, he sighed. I suppose you've got more questions. Miss Marple smiled politely. Just one, Mr. Pritchard. Do you remember where Margaret Elmsley was last seen alive? Robbie hesitated, then muttered, it was the old summer house near the woods. She used to walk there often. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. And was it place ever searched? He scoffed. Not properly. Folks assumed she'd run off. Miss Marple nodded. I think it's time we looked again. The summer house stood at the edge of the Henshaw estate, half forgotten beneath a canopy of overgrown branches. Miss Marple arrived there alongside Inspector Merton, who had finally conceded that her instincts were worth following. You think she was killed here? Merton asked, eyeing the dilapidated structure. But Miss Marple stepped forward, running a gloved hand along the weathered doorframe. I suspect she was last seen alive here, she corrected, which makes it an excellent place to start. The wooden door creaked as it swung open. Inside, dust motes danced in the dim light. The space was small, with a single table, a few chairs, and a stone fireplace. It was there, in the fireplace, that Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught something unusual. A small, charred scrap of paper, wedged between the stones. Carefully, she retrieved it, though most of it had burned away. A single word remained visible. Margaret. Miss Marple looked up, meeting Merton's gaze. Someone tried to destroy evidence, she murmured, but not all of it. Merton frowned. You think Jonathan found something here? Something that led to his death? Miss Marple nodded. Jonathan was digging into the past, and the past, Inspector, is not as silent as some might wish. As they stepped out of the summer house, Miss Marple turned to Merton. Inspector, I believe I know why Jonathan was killed. Merton crossed his arms. Do tell. Miss Marple's voice was calm, measured. Jonathan was on the verge of proving something, that Margaret had not run away, that she had been murdered. And someone who has been watching all these years, decided it was too great a risk to let him continue. Merton exhaled sharply. And the letters, who's sending them? Miss Marple smiled slightly. Ah, Inspector. That is the final piece of the puzzle, because now, at last, she had an idea of who had been behind it all, and they were running out of time. Chapter 10. A name in ashes. Inspector Merton stood outside the old summer house, staring at the burned scrap of paper Miss Marple had just retrieved from the fireplace. The single remaining word Margaret said, heavy between them. The village of St. Mary Mead had been content to forget Margaret Elmsley. But the truth had a way of forcing itself to the surface. Jonathan Henshaw had been searching for answers, and now he was dead. Someone had been sending letters to stir up the past. And here, in this forgotten summer house, a name had been burned into silence. Miss Marple tucked the charred scrap carefully into her handbag. Someone destroyed this evidence deliberately. Inspector, the question is, when Merton exhaled, scanning the overgrown structure, could have been years ago. The fire's long gone cold. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with quiet intelligence. Or it could have been much more recent. We are dealing with someone who is still very much afraid of the past. Merton's brow furrowed. If someone wanted to bury Margaret's story, why send the letters? It doesn't add up. Miss Marple's fingers tightened on the clasp of her bag. Ah, but you see, Inspector, the one who killed Margaret is not the one sending the letters. No. The letters are coming from someone who wants justice at last, and I believe Jonathan Henshaw found them before his death. Merton shook his head. And you think whoever sent the letters is in danger now? Miss Marple's voice was firm. I think they already were in danger, and if we don't act quickly, they might share Margaret's fate. Miss Marple wasted no time. That very afternoon, she made her way to Beatrice Cavendish's home. The moment Beatrice opened the door, Miss Marple knew something was wrong. The usually composed woman looked pale, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed her skirts. Miss Marple, she said, her voice unusually strained. I wasn't expecting you. Miss Marple stepped inside without hesitation. My dear, I believe we must have a serious talk. Beatrice hesitated before closing the door. I suppose you want to ask about Margaret again. Miss Marple gave a small smile. I do, but more importantly, I need to ask about Jonathan. Beatrice's eyes darkened. I already told you I found him dead. There was nothing I could do. Miss Marple studied her carefully. But you knew why he had to die, didn't you? Beatrice stiffened. That's absurd. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle but firm. Beatrice, my dear, I believe you were the one who sent the letters. For a moment, there was only silence. Then Beatrice let out a shaky breath and sank into a chair. You've always been sharp, Miss Marple, she murmured. Not. Miss Marple took the seat across from her. Tell me the truth, my dear. You knew Margaret, didn't you, more than you let on? Beatrice nodded, her fingers twisting together. I did. When I was a child, she was kind to me. I admired her. But then one day she was gone, and no one spoke about it. It was as if she had never existed. Miss Marple's gaze was steady. And so, you started searching. Beatrice exhaled. I suppose I did. It started with small things, old letters, whispers from the past. Then Jonathan came along, asking the same questions I had buried for years. He was close, Miss Marple. Close, and someone knew it. Miss Marple's voice was soft. And that someone killed him. Beatrice swallowed hard. Yes, I never meant for him to die. I just wanted the truth to come out. Miss Marple reached forward, placing a hand gently over Beatrice's. I believe you, my dear, but we must finish what Jonathan started before the killer strikes again. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting in steady, thoughtful motions. She had solved many mysteries in her time, but this one carried a particular weight. Margaret had been silenced long ago. Jonathan had been killed for trying to expose the truth, and Beatrice had been trying, in her own way, to bring justice at last. But the true murderer, the one who had buried Margaret, beneath the roses was still out there, watching, waiting. Miss Marple had one more visit to make. The time had come to confront the past. Chapter 11. The truth beneath the rose. Miss had spent a lifetime observing human nature, and she knew one truth above all. Murder was rarely a matter of convenience. It was almost always personal. Margaret Elmsley's death had not been a random act of violence, nor had Jonathan Henshaw's. They had both come too close to something that someone had buried as carefully as Margaret's body beneath the roses. Now, with Beatrice Cavendish's reluctant confession that she had sent the letters, Miss Marple was more certain than ever. The true murderer had been watching, growing desperate, and desperate people made mistakes. It was time to draw them out. The morning was overcast as Miss Marple made her way toward St. Mary Mead's vicarage. The vicar's wife, Helen Pritchard, had always seemed composed, gracious, and utterly proper. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that proper Englishwomen were just as capable of dark secrets as anyone else. Helen answered the door with a tight smile. Miss Marple, what a surprise. I do apologize for calling so early, Miss Marple said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. But I fear I must trouble you with a most serious matter. Helen hesitated for only a moment, before nodding. Of course. What is it? Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting bag in her lap. She glanced around the room, taking in the well-ordered bookshelves and polished furniture. I was thinking about Margaret Elmsley. This morning, she began casually. Helen's smile didn't falter, but her fingers tightened around the edge of her apron. A tragic business, of course. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, particularly because she was killed by someone she trusted. For the first time, Helen's mask slipped just slightly. You think she was murdered? Oh, my dear, I don't think I know. Helen's hand twitched at her side. I don't know what you're suggesting, Miss Marple, but Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes gentle but unwavering. Jonathan Henshaw was trying to tell someone the truth before he died. I believe you already know what that truth is. Helen swallowed. That's absurd. Jonathan had heart trouble. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. But the moment he was close to revealing something, he was gone. And now, with Margaret's body discovered, the past has come rushing back, hasn't it? Helen stood abruptly. I think you should leave, Miss Marple. Miss Marple remained seated. I will, but first, tell me, did you know where Margaret was buried before anyone else did? Helen's face paled. Of course not. Miss Marple gave her a kind smile. Then why did I see you near the Henshaw estate the morning after the letters were first received? For a single moment, there was silence. Then, with a strangled gasp, Helen Pritchard sank into a chair. Oh God, she whispered. But Miss Marple waited. Helen closed her eyes. I didn't kill her. But you know who did, Miss Marple said softly. Helen's hands trembled. I was young, Margaret. She was beautiful, confident. She had him wrapped around her finger. Miss Marple's lips tightened. Your husband, Helen nodded, silent tears slipping down her face. He was obsessed with her. I knew it, even before he admitted it. He wanted her. And Margaret, she laughed at him. She refused him. Miss Marple's expression did not change. And so, he killed her. Helen shook her head. I don't know that. But her voice faltered. The night she disappeared, he came home late. His hands were dirty. He burned something in the fireplace. Her breath hitched. And he wouldn't look at me. Miss Marple took a deep breath. You suspected? Helen let out a shuddering sigh. I knew. And yet you said nothing. Helen covered her face with her hands. I was afraid. Afraid of him. Afraid of what he might do if he knew I had doubts. Miss Marple reached over, patting Helen's hand gently. My dear, the truth has a way of surfacing. And I believe the time has come to finally set things right. By afternoon, Miss Marple was sitting in the drawing room of Inspector Merton's office, sipping tea while he paced. So, the vicar murdered Margaret Elmsley, he said flatly. But Miss Marple gave him a pointed look. That, Inspector, is what we must confirm. Merton shook his head. It makes sense. He was a respected man in the village. No one would have suspected him. And Helen. She kept quiet out of fear. Miss Marple nodded. But what I find most interesting, Inspector, is that someone knew before the letters were sent. Merton frowned. What do you mean? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. The body in the garden was buried long ago. Yes, but someone has been watching all these years. The letters were meant to force the vicar's secret into the open. Merton exhaled sharply. And now we just have to prove it. Miss Marple set down her cup with a satisfied nod. Yes, Inspector. and I do believe we shall, because now, at last, she had the truth, and there was only one thing left to make the murderer confess. Chapter 12. The Murderer Unmasked. Was a cold evening in St. Mary Mead, the kind that sent the villagers hurrying home before darkness fully settled. But Miss Marple was in no hurry. She had spent decades unraveling secrets, patiently drawing out the truth from those who wished to keep it hidden. And tonight, at last, the mystery of Margaret Elmsley's murder would come to an end at Henshaw Manor. A meeting had been arranged. Inspector Merton had been reluctant at first. Police work was supposed to be based on evidence, not careful manipulation, but even he had to admit that Miss Marple's instincts had been correct so far. She had asked for all those involved to be present: Beatrice Cavendish, Robbie Pritchard, Helen Pritchard, and Reverend Charles Pritchard himself. The murderer would not be able to hide among them any longer. The drawing room was dimly lit, the fire casting long shadows as Miss Marple settled into her chair. Inspector Merton stood near the window, his arms crossed, while the others sat stiffly. In the heavy Victorian furniture, the tension was palpable. Reverend Pritchard was the only one who appeared outwardly calm. He adjusted his clerical collar and glanced at Miss Marple with a carefully neutral expression. "I must say, Miss Marple, this gathering seems rather dramatic," he remarked lightly. "Are we to be entertained with one of your famous deductions?" Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Oh, I do hope so, Reverend. It is always satisfying when the truth is revealed." A flicker of something passed through his eyes, just for a moment, but it was enough. Miss Marple set down her knitting. "We now know, beyond a doubt, that Margaret Elmsley was murdered. And we also know that someone in this room has been keeping that secret for a very long time." Beatrice let out a soft gasp, but Miss Marple continued, "I must thank you, Beatrice, for your letters. Without them, this case might never have come to light." Reverend Pritchard let out a small chuckle. "Ah, yes, those letters that have stirred up so much trouble. An unfortunate business, but hardly proof of murder." Miss Marple turned her gaze to him. "And yet, Reverend, you were rather quick to dismiss Margaret's disappearance all those years ago. Most peculiar, considering how fond you once were of her." A silence fell over the room. Beatrice turned sharply toward him. "Is that true?" Pritchard hesitated. I may have admired her, once. She was a striking young woman." Miss Marple nodded. "Oh, indeed, and it must have been humiliating when she rejected you." Helen flinched, her hands gripping the armrest of her chair. "Oh, God," Miss Marple continued, her voice deceptively gentle. "The truth, Reverend, is that you were in love with Margaret. You pursued her, and when she refused you, you were furious. That anger led to something far worse." Pritchard let out a strained laugh. "Miss Marple, you're making quite the story." Miss Marple ignored him. "Margaret Elmsley was last seen alive near the summer house. That was where she met you that night, wasn't it?" Pritchard's face darkened, but he said nothing. But Miss Marple knitted a few more rows before speaking again. "You lost your temper, didn't you, Reverend? She refused you, perhaps. She laughed at you. And in that moment, you struck her. Not meaning to kill her, of course, but sometimes, in the heat of the moment." Helen Pritchard let out a choked sob. Reverend Pritchard's jaw tightened. "This is all speculation." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "But you see, Reverend, I have proof." She reached into her handbag and withdrew the small, burned scrap of paper from the summerhouse fireplace. "You burned something that night, didn't you? A letter from Margaret, perhaps. Or was it her scarf, covered in blood?" His face paled, but still, he did not speak. Inspector Merton took a step forward. "You can deny it all you like, Pritchard, but it's over." Miss Marple gave him a sympathetic look. "The roses, Reverend, that's where you buried her, isn't it? You thought no one would find her, not after so many years." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Reverend Pritchard let out a slow, shuddering breath. "She shouldn't have laughed at me," he murmured. Helen gasped. Covering her mouth, Pritchard sank back into his chair, his hands trembling. "I didn't mean to kill her, but when she rejected me, I saw red. She fell. She hit her head. I didn't know what to do." Miss Marple's voice was quiet. "So you buried her, and you let the village forget her." Pritchard let out a hollow laugh. "And I almost got away with it." Inspector Merton stepped forward. "Not anymore." Later that night, as the village buzzed with news of the vicar's arrest, Miss Marple sat quietly in her cottage, finishing her knitting. Justice had finally come for Margaret Elmsley, and the past, at last, was no longer silent. Thank you for tuning in to Mystery Unlocked. If you enjoyed the intrigue, suspense, and the thrill of the chase, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon. Stay updated on more captivating detective adventures that will keep you at the edge of your seat. Your support makes it possible to continue bringing these stories to life. Keep the mysteries alive until next time.